Where did you get that necklace?
I found it. It's mine.
It was my son's. He died.
Ma'am, please, let's talk.
Tell me the truth.
He gave it to me before he died.
Where did you get that necklace?
I found it. Why?
That's my son's. He died.
Ma'am, are you sure? Your son? This was his?
Yes, please tell me everything. Where did you get that necklace?
It's mine. Who are you?
That was my son's. He died.
Ma'am, what's going on? Your son? No, this can't be.
Tell me everything.
Rich lady saw her dead son's necklace on a homeless man. What happened next shocked him. The morning market on Freedom Avenue smelled of ripe mangoes, diesel smoke, and roasted corn. Vendors shouted prices over one another. Children weaved between the stalls chasing chickens that had escaped their crates. And somewhere a radio crackled out an old high-life song that nobody was really listening to. Adaeze Okonkwo listened to all of it like a symphony. She had been selling second-hand clothes from the same wooden table for 11 years. Ever since her husband died and left her with 2 children and a debt, she was still, slowly, paying off. Her table sat at the corner where the fabric sellers met the fruit sellers, a spot she'd fought hard to keep, and every morning she arrived before the sun to lay out her folded shirts and dresses with the same careful pride a jeweler might use to arrange diamonds. "Good morning, Mama Adaeze," called Ifeoma, the woman who sold plantains 2 stalls down. "You look tired today." "Tired is a luxury," Adaeze said, smiling despite the ache in her lower back. "Tired means you're still standing." She was folding a blue blouse when she heard the commotion begin. It started the way these things always started, with a raised voice and a crowd gathering like flies to spilled sugar. Adaeze looked up to see a man being shoved backward by one of the market's security guards, a broad-shouldered young man named Tobena who took his job far too seriously. "I told you, no beggars here," Tobena barked. "This is a place of business, not a shelter." The man stumbled but didn't fall. He was tall, though his shoulders curled inward as if trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable, less of a target. His clothes were filthy, a grey hoodie gone brown with dust, pants torn at both knees, sandals held together with wire. A thick black garbage bag hung from one shoulder, presumably holding everything he owned in the world. His beard was unkempt, his dreadlocks matted and grey with road dust, and his eyes— Adaeze noticed this immediately. His eyes did not match the rest of him. They were sharp, alert, watching everything, missing nothing. The eyes of a man who had once been taught to read a room before he ever learned to read a book. "I wasn't stealing anything," the man said quietly. His voice was low, controlled, almost formal in a way that seemed strange coming from someone dressed like him. "I only asked if there was work, sweeping, carrying anything. We don't hire street trash," Tobena sneered, and several vendors nearby laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughing at someone lower than yourself was its own kind of comfort. "Get out before I call the real police." The man's jaw tightened. For just a moment, something flickered behind those sharp eyes, not fear, but a kind of contained fury, the fury of a man who was choosing deliberately not to fight back. He turned to walk away. That was when he passed Adaeze's table, and his garbage bag caught the corner of a folded stack of shirts, sending them tumbling into the dust. "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he said immediately, crouching down to gather them, before Adaeze could even react. His hands moved quickly, brushing dirt from the fabric, folding each shirt back into a neat rectangle with a precision that seemed almost out of place. "Here, I'm sorry. I should have been more careful." Adaeze looked at him, really looked at him, the way she rarely allowed herself to look at strangers, because looking too closely at suffering in this market was a habit that could break your heart 6 times before lunch. "It's just cloth," she said gently, taking the shirts from his hands. "Nobody died." He paused at that, something crossing his face too quickly for her to name it. "No," he said softly. "Nobody died. Are you hungry?" Adaeze asked. The man blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Around them a few vendors were still watching, whispering. Tabena had crossed his arms, waiting to see if he'd need to intervene again. "Ma'am, I don't want trouble for you," the man said. "I didn't ask if you wanted trouble. I asked if you were hungry." She reached under her table and pulled out a small cloth bundle, 2 boiled eggs, and a chunk of bread she'd packed for her own lunch. It wasn't much. It was, in fact, everything she'd brought to eat that day, but something in this stranger's exhausted, careful eyes told her that today her hunger could wait. "I can't take your food," he said, though his voice wavered. "You can, and you will," Ade said, pressing the bundle into his hands with the same firmness she used when her children refused their vegetables. "Eat first. Talk later, if you want to talk." He stared at the small bundle in his hands like it was made of gold. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were wet, though he blinked hard and looked away before the tears could fall. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "You don't know me." "I don't need to know you to see you're a man who's had a hard road," Adaise said, returning to her folding as if this were the most ordinary conversation in the world. "My mother used to say, feed a stranger, and you feed yourself twice over, once in the belly, once in the soul." The man's throat worked as he swallowed. "Your mother sounds wise." "She was poor and wise. The two often traveled together." Adaise smiled, though there was something sad behind it. "What's your name?" He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, the kind of pause a person makes when deciding whether to give the truth or a smaller, safer version of it. "Kelechi," he finally said. "You can call me Kelechi." "Well, Kelechi," Adaise said, "welcome to Freedom Market. Eat your eggs before Tabena decides you're loitering again." For the first time since he'd arrived, the ghost of a smile touched the corner of the man's cracked lips. He sat down on an overturned crate near her table, unwrapped the bundle with hands that trembled slightly, and ate like a man who hadn't tasted kindness in a very long time. Adaise didn't ask more questions. She had learned, over 11 years of watching people pass through this market, that some stories needed time before they could be told, and that the greatest gift you could give a broken person wasn't curiosity, but patience. She didn't notice, at first, the thin silver chain disappearing beneath the collar of his hoodie. She didn't see the way his hand occasionally drifted up to touch something hidden against his chest, as if checking that it was still there, still safe, still real. She had no way of knowing that the object hanging from that chain was a ruby the size of a thumbnail, set in gold, engraved on the back with 2 initials that hadn't been spoken aloud in nearly 6 years. She only knew that a hungry man was eating her lunch beneath the shade of her stall, and that for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt no fear sitting beside him. Only a strange, quiet certainty that their paths crossing today was not an accident. By the time the sun reached its peak and the market noise swelled into its usual midday roar, Kelechi had finished eating, thanked her 3 more times, and disappeared back into the crowd the way he'd come, quietly, carefully, like a man used to not being seen. Adaise didn't know his real name. She didn't know that 6 blocks away, in a mansion behind iron gates and manicured hedges, an old woman named Chidinma Adeyemi was staring at a photograph of a boy who had drowned, supposedly, in a boating accident 6 years ago, and weeping, as she did every single morning, into a picture of a face she would give anything in the world to see again. She had no way of knowing that the boy in that photograph and the man who had just eaten her lunch shared the same crooked smile, the same sharp, watchful eyes. She only knew that tomorrow she would bring 2 lunches instead of 1. She had no idea how much that small decision would change everything. That evening, Adaise walked home along the dirt path behind the market, past the dyer's yard, where indigo cloth hung drying like flags of some forgotten kingdom. Her son, Chukwuemeka, waited at the gate, 9 years old and already trying to look like the man of the house. "Mama, you're late," he said, taking the empty basket before she could protest. "I met someone today," she told him, "a man who needed kindness more than money. Did you give him money? I gave him lunch." Chukwuemeka frowned, the frown of a child who understood exactly how little food their own house had some nights. "Our lunch? There's always enough, Emeka," Adai said, ruffling his hair. "Enough for us, and enough left for whoever needs it more." Inside, boiling yams for dinner, she thought about the stranger's eyes, the way they hadn't matched his ragged clothes, the way his hands had folded her shirts with such careful precision, as if some part of him remembered a life where meals were eaten at tables and a person's name meant something. She thought, too, about the way he'd hesitated before saying Kelechi, the name coming out just slightly too rehearsed, like a coat borrowed rather than owned. It wasn't her business, she told herself. Whatever he was running from, it wasn't her place to pry it loose. Her mother had taught her that some wounds needed air, not questions. But that night, lying awake beside her sleeping children, she found herself thinking of him anyway, wondering where he would sleep, wondering if he was cold. She didn't know why his face had lodged itself so firmly behind her eyes. She only knew that when sleep finally came, she dreamed of a boy standing at the edge of a wide blue river, looking back over his shoulder as if waiting for someone to call his name and bring him home. She woke before dawn, unsettled, and packed 2 lunches instead of 1. The second time Kelechi came to Freedom Market, it wasn't for food. Adaze was arguing with a customer over the price of a second-hand jacket, a stubborn man who wanted to pay half of what it was worth, when she saw him hovering at the edge of her stall, waiting patiently, the same garbage bag slung over his shoulder, the same watchful eyes scanning the crowd like a man checking exits. 2,000 naira, not 1, Adaze told the customer firmly. "The zipper still works. Feel it." The man grumbled but paid, and only then did Adaeze turn her full attention to Kelechi. "You came back," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "I wanted to return this." He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small folded cloth, the same cloth she'd wrapped his lunch in the day before, now washed clean, the corners pressed flat as if he'd ironed it with his hands. "And to thank you properly. I didn't do that yesterday. I just ate and disappeared like a thief." "You're not a thief," Adaze said, taking the cloth. "A thief doesn't wash the bag he stole food in." Something in his face softened, just slightly, at that. It was the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen from him. "I brought extra today," she said, reaching under her table, "in case you came." "You didn't have to." "I know." She handed him the bundle anyway. "Sit. Tobena's not working today, so you're safe from his heroics." Kelechi laughed, a short, surprised sound, like the laugh had escaped before he could stop it. It transformed his whole face, and for a moment Adaeze saw something underneath the dirt and the beard and the exhaustion, a man who once had probably laughed often and easily. He sat on the same overturned crate as the day before, and this time he stayed longer. He asked about her children. He asked about the market, about which stalls sold the freshest fish, about how long she'd been selling clothes. His questions were careful, deflecting attention away from himself with the practiced ease of someone who'd had a lot of practice not being asked about his own life. But Adaze noticed things. She noticed how his eyes lingered just for a second on a woman walking past with 2 children in matching school uniforms. A flicker of something that looked almost like grief. She noticed how, when a car backfired somewhere on the main road, his whole body tensed like a soldier bracing for gunfire, before he caught himself and forced his shoulders to relax. And she noticed, more than once, his hand drifting up to touch something beneath the collar of his hoodie, a small, unconscious gesture, the way a person might touch a wound to make sure it was still healing or still there. "What's that?" she finally asked. nodding toward his collar. Kelechi's hand froze mid-motion. For a long moment he said nothing, and Adais wondered if she'd finally pushed too far, crossed some invisible line he'd drawn around himself like a fence. Then, slowly, he pulled the chain out from beneath his hoodie. The ruby caught the midday light and threw it back in a deep, burning red, a stone the size of a thumbnail, set in gold that had somehow, impossibly, survived whatever ordeal had brought this man to sleeping on the streets. It looked wildly out of place against his filthy clothes, like a crown jewel dropped in the mud. Adai's breath caught. "That's beautiful," she said quietly, "and valuable. Kelechi, if anyone sees that—" "I know." His voice had gone tight. "I know what could happen. I've thought about selling it 100 times. I've thought about it when I was hungrier than I've ever been in my life, when I hadn't eaten in 3 days, when the cold made my bones feel like glass." "Why didn't you?" He tucked the necklace back beneath his collar with careful, trembling hands. "Because it's the only thing I have left that proves I existed before all this. Before the streets. Before—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Before what?" Adais asked gently. Kelechi looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes, the desperate, exhausted need to finally tell someone the truth, fighting against years of learned silence, of hiding, of survival built on nobody knowing his real name. "Before I died," he finally said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Adai's hands went still on the shirt she'd been folding. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, a sharp voice cut across the market. "You beggar, get away from that stall before I call security again." It was Ngozi, a fabric seller 2 stalls down, a woman whose tongue was sharper than her scissors. She marched over, waving a broom like a weapon, her face twisted with the particular contempt some people reserved for those who had less than them. "He's not bothering anyone," Adais said, standing between them. "He's bothering the customers. Look at him, filthy, probably diseased, probably a thief. Adais, you should be ashamed, letting trash like this sit at your stall like he's somebody." Kelechi rose slowly to his feet. For just a moment, one single moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes, an authority that seemed to rise up from somewhere deep and old, the ghost of a man used to commanding rooms, used to being obeyed. His spine straightened, his chin lifted. Then, just as quickly, he folded back into himself, shoulders curling inward, eyes dropping to the ground, the posture of a man who had learned, painfully, that power was dangerous to show. "I'll go," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for the trouble, Mom." "Kelechi, wait." Adais started, but he was already walking away, weaving through the crowd with the same practiced invisibility he'd used the day before, the black garbage bag bouncing against his shoulder, the ruby necklace hidden once more beneath torn fabric. Ngozi sniffed with satisfaction. "You attract strange ones, Adais. That man has a devil's eyes. Mark my words." Adais said nothing. She was still staring at the space where he disappeared into the crowd, turning his words over and over in her mind like stones in a riverbed. "Before I died." What kind of man said something like that and meant it? She thought of the ruby, glowing deep red against his ragged clothes. She thought of his hands, folding shirts with careful precision. She thought of the flash of command in his eyes when Ngozi had insulted him, gone as quickly as it appeared, but unmistakably real, the reflex of someone who had once mattered, once been powerful, once been someone. That night, she packed 3 lunches instead of 2, though she couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked. She didn't know that 6 blocks away, behind iron gates, an old woman named Chidinma Adeyemi sat in her private study, staring at a police file she'd requested, reopened for the 4th time in 6 years. A file about a boating accident, a missing body never recovered, a son declared dead without a funeral because there had been nothing left to bury. Chidinma ran her thumb over the edge of a faded photograph. A young man, maybe 26, laughing at something just outside the frame, wearing a graduation gown far too big for his shoulders. Beside the photograph sat a velvet box, empty now for 6 years, the exact shape of a ruby pendant on a gold chain still pressed into its worn lining like a ghost. "Where did you go, Obina?" she whispered to the photograph, the way she did every night before sleep found her, though sleep rarely came easily anymore. "Where did you go? And why won't you come home?" Her nephew Fabian, who managed the family's shipping business now that her husband was gone and her son was presumed drowned, had told her 100 times to let it rest. "He's gone, Auntie. 6 years. You have to accept it and move forward, for the sake of the company, for the sake of your health." He said it kindly enough, but there was always something underneath his kindness that made her uneasy. An eagerness, perhaps, for the grieving to finally end, so the paperwork could finally close. She didn't trust that eagerness. She never had. Chidinma closed the file and locked it back in her desk drawer, the same way she did every night, and told herself, as she'd told herself for 6 long years, that a mother knows. A mother feels it in her bones when her child is truly gone, and Chidinma had never once felt that stillness. Somewhere out there, some stubborn, unshakable instinct told her her son was still breathing. She had no idea that less than an hour's walk from her mansion, on a wooden crate beside a second-hand clothing stall, that same son had just tucked a ruby necklace back beneath a torn hoodie collar, his hands trembling with the effort of staying hidden one more day. She didn't know that tomorrow fate would finally bring these two women's worlds crashing together, and that nothing in Freedom Market would ever be the same again. 3 days passed before Kelechi returned to Freedom Market, and in those 3 days, Adais found herself watching the crowd more than she watched her own merchandise, scanning every ragged silhouette for a familiar hunch of shoulders, a familiar, wary gaze. She told herself it was simple concern, a mother's instinct extended toward a stranger who needed mothering. But some nights, lying awake beside her sleeping children, she admitted a quieter truth to herself, that she thought about him more than concern alone could explain, that his voice, low and careful and strangely formal, had lodged itself somewhere she couldn't easily dislodge it. When he finally reappeared on the 4th morning, she almost didn't recognize him. Someone, she never learned who, had given him a clean shirt, too large but at least whole, and he'd washed the dust from his dreadlocks and beard as best he could with whatever water he'd found. He still looked exhausted, still looked hunted, but something in his posture had shifted slightly, as if 3 days of carrying a secret without release had worn a groove into him that he was only now beginning to smooth over. "You look different," Adais said, unable to hide her relief at seeing him. "I found someone willing to let me wash at their well," Kelechi said, managing something close to a real smile. "It's the small mercies that keep a man human. Sit. Eat." She'd already prepared his portion before he arrived, a habit now rather than a kindness she had to remember to extend. He sat, and for a while they simply existed together in the ordinary rhythm of the market. The calling vendors, the honking motorbikes weaving between pedestrians, the smell of frying plantain drifting from somewhere nearby. It was, Adais thought, the kind of silence that only grew comfortable between people who had decided, without saying so out loud, to trust each other. "Can I ask you something?" she finally said. "You can ask. I can't promise to answer." "Fair enough." She folded a dress slowly, buying herself time to choose her words. "The other day, you said you died. Before all this, what did you mean?" Kelechi's hand stilled around the bread he'd been eating. For a long moment, the market noise seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them, and the weight of a question that had been waiting 6 years to be asked by someone who might actually listen to the answer. I meant it exactly as I said it, he finally answered, voice barely above a whisper. The man I used to be is dead, officially. There's a death certificate somewhere with his name on it. A grave even, though there's nothing inside it. That's not possible, Adaiz said slowly. A person can't die and also sit in front of me eating bread. You'd be surprised what's possible when the right people want you to disappear. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the sharp, watchful thing behind his eyes surfaced again, the ghost of the man Ngozi had called dangerous. I was on a boat. There was an accident, or what looked like one. I went into the water, and when I came up, I understood something I'll never be able to ununderstand. What? That someone had wanted me to stay under? Adaiz's hands went cold. Someone tried to kill you? I can't prove it. I have no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but the memory of hands that felt too deliberate to be an accident, and a boat that left faster than any rescue attempt should have allowed. He shook his head slowly. So I let them believe I'd drowned. I swam to shore miles from where anyone was looking, and I never went home. Because if I went home, whoever wanted me gone would simply try again, and next time they might succeed. Your family, Adaize breathed. They think you're dead. Something raw crossed his face, a grief so old and so carefully buried that seeing it surface was like watching a wound reopen. My mother thinks I'm dead, he said. She's buried an empty coffin. She's mourned me for 6 years, and there hasn't been a single day I haven't wanted to walk through her gate and tell her the truth. Then why haven't you? Because I don't know who I can trust anymore. His voice cracked on the last word. If I go back and the wrong person finds out first, it isn't just my life at risk this time, it's hers. Adaize sat with this for a long moment, the weight of it settling over her like a heavy cloth. Around them, the market continued its indifferent noise, vendors haggling, children laughing, the world entirely unaware that beside a second-hand clothing stall, a resurrection story was quietly, carefully being told. The necklace, she said slowly, it's hers, your mother's. It was my father's before he died. She gave it to me the day I turned 25. Kelechi's fingers drifted unconsciously to his collar. I've never taken it off, not once in 6 years. It's the only proof I have of who I really am. And some days, when the hunger and the cold make it hard to remember, it's the only thing that reminds me I'm not just a ghost wandering the earth. What's your real name? Adaize asked softly. He looked at her for a long, searching moment, weighing 6 years of careful silence against the strange, undeniable trust that had grown between them over 3 short meetings. Obinna, he finally said. My name is Obinna Adeyemi. Adaize had never heard the name before. She had no reason to connect it to the wealthy shipping family whose name appeared on billboards and charity galas she'd never attended, whose world existed so far above her own that their paths should never by any natural law have crossed. But something in the way he said it, reverent and terrified all at once, told her this name carried weight far beyond the man sitting in front of her. Obinna, she repeated gently, testing the shape of it. It's a good name, a strong name. It used to belong to someone strong, he said. I'm not sure how much of him is left. He folded my shirts with more care than most people fold their own laundry, Adaize said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. He gave up food when he was starving because he didn't want to burden a stranger. That sounds like plenty of strength to me, Obinna. His eyes filled, and this time he didn't look away fast enough to hide it. A single tear slid down through the dust on his cheek, and he wiped it away almost angrily, as if ashamed of his own grief. Nobody's called me that in 6 years, he said. Not once. Well, Adaize said, returning to her folding with deliberate normalcy, giving him space to gather himself. You'll have to get used to it because I intend to use it from now on. Kelechi was never going to suit you anyway. You don't look like a Kelechi, he laughed, a real laugh this time, wet with tears but genuine, the sound of a man remembering, slowly, painfully, what it felt like to be seen. Neither of them noticed the sleek black car that had slowed at the edge of the market, its tinted windows rolled down, just enough for the driver to study the crowd with narrowed, calculating eyes before speeding away again. Neither of them knew that Fabian Adeyemi had been driving through Freedom Market on unrelated business, and that something about a tall, ragged man sitting beside a second-hand clothing stall had made him pause, just for a moment, with an unease he couldn't yet explain. Fabian had told himself, all the way back to the office, that it was nothing. A trick of the light, a passing resemblance, the kind of thing grief made a person imagine in every crowd. He had seen it happen to his aunt 100 times. A stranger's walk on the street, a laugh in a restaurant, and suddenly she was convinced Obinna had come back to her, only to collapse into fresh grief when the stranger turned and revealed an unfamiliar face. But Fabian was not a grieving mother. Fabian was a man who had spent 6 years quietly consolidating control of a shipping empire that should never have been his. And something about the set of that stranger's shoulders, the particular way he'd tilted his head while listening to the woman at the clothing stall, had struck a chord of memory he didn't want struck. He parked the car 3 streets away and sat gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening, his mind working through possibilities he'd spent 6 years trying not to consider. It's not him, he told himself. It can't be him. I made sure of that. But the thought that followed was colder still. The thought that if there was even the smallest chance he was wrong, he would need to know. Immediately. Before his aunt found out first, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a private investigator who specialized in discretion above all else. I need you to watch someone for me, Fabian said quietly. A man, homeless or pretending to be. He's been seen near Freedom Market. I want to know everything about him before the week is out. On the other end of the line, he heard the click of a pen against paper. And if it turns out to be who you think it is? Fabian closed his eyes, the weight of 6 carefully constructed years pressing down on his chest. Then we handle it, he said. Quietly. The way we should have handled it the first time. Chidinma Adeyemi had not set foot in a place like Freedom Market in over 20 years. Her world was one of quiet chauffeured cars and hushed boardrooms, of charity galas where her presence alone could raise millions for causes she genuinely cared about, of a mansion so large that some days she went from breakfast to dinner without seeing another living soul. She had built a life of comfort after her husband's death, and after Obinna's. A life that looked from the outside like peace, but which she privately understood to be something closer to a slow, patient waiting. So when her old friend Yemisi insisted on dragging her to Freedom Market that morning, "You need fresh air, Chidinma. You need to remember there's a world outside that mansion," she had agreed mostly to quiet the woman's persistent nagging. She regretted it within the first 10 minutes. The noise was overwhelming. The smells too sharp, the crowd pressing too close for a woman used to personal space measured in acres rather than inches. She kept close to Yemisi, her expensive cream suit drawing curious glances from vendors who clearly recognized wealth when they saw it, her pearl earrings catching light that seemed almost too bright after years spent mostly indoors. "There's a wonderful fabric seller just ahead," Yemisi was saying. "You'll love her prints, Chidinma, truly." Chidinma wasn't listening. Her eyes had caught on something across the crowded lane, a flash of deep red, catching the midday sun, disappearing and reappearing between moving bodies like something glimpsed underwater. She stopped walking entirely. "Chidinma, what is it?" She didn't answer. She was moving now, pushing through the crowd with a desperation that shocked even herself, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way it hadn't in years, her mind screaming a single impossible thought over and over. That color. That exact shade of red. I would know it anywhere. I chose that stone myself. She broke through the crowd and stopped dead. A man sat on an overturned crate beside a second-hand clothing stall, dressed in rags, his hair matted with dust, his beard unkempt and wild. And around his neck, hanging plainly visible where his shirt had shifted, was a ruby pendant on a gold chain. The exact ruby, the exact gold, the exact necklace she had clasped around her son's neck with her own trembling hands on his 25th birthday, 6 years and a lifetime ago. "That necklace," Chidinma said, her voice shaking so badly the words barely held together. "Where did you get that necklace?" The man froze. Daze, standing beside her stall, looked up sharply at the sound of the elegant stranger's voice, at the raw, desperate hunger in her eyes. "Ma'am, the man started, and stopped, his own voice catching. "Answer me!" Chidinma's composure, decades in the making, shattered completely. Her finger shot out, pointing at the necklace with a hand that trembled violently. "That belonged to my son who is dead. Tell me right now how a beggar came to be wearing my dead son's necklace, or so help me, I will call every police officer in this city." The crowd around them had gone silent, drawn by the sudden drama the way crowds always were, phones already emerging from pockets, whispers rippling outward like water disturbed by a stone. The man rose slowly to his feet, and something in his posture had changed. The careful, hunched invisibility replaced by something straighter, something that looked, for just a moment, dangerously close to dignity. "Mama," he said so quietly it was almost lost beneath the market noise. "Mama, it's me." Chidinma went perfectly still. "What did you say?" she whispered. "It's me," the man repeated, his voice cracking wide open, 6 years of careful silence collapsing in an instant. "It's Obinna, Mama. I'm alive. I've been alive this whole time." For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. Chidinma stared at the ragged, filthy stranger in front of her, searching his face with the desperate intensity of a woman trying to see through 6 years of dirt and hardship to find something familiar underneath. The shape of his eyes, the particular curve of his jaw, the crooked smile that had once lit up every room he entered. "No," she said, shaking her head violently, backing away. "No. This is a trick. This is some cruel trick. My son drowned. My son is dead. You are a beggar who somehow stole—" "I have a scar," the man said quickly, desperately, closing the distance between them despite her retreat. "Behind my left ear. From when I fell off my bicycle at 8 years old, and you cried harder than I did while the doctor stitched it closed. I have a birthmark on my right shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon, that Papa used to say was proof I was born under a lucky sky. I remember the lullaby you used to sing when I couldn't sleep, the one about the moon, chasing the sun across the water, the one your own mother sang to you." Chidinma's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat. "I remember everything, Mama," Obinna said, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face. "I remember every single thing, because remembering was the only thing that kept me alive out here." Chidinma's legs gave out. Yemisi and Daze both lunged forward to catch her before she hit the ground, and the old woman collapsed into their arms, sobbing, her carefully composed world dissolving completely in the middle of a crowded market, in front of strangers, in front of phones already recording, in front of a son she had buried and mourned and now, impossibly, had found alive. "My baby," she wept, reaching for him with shaking hands, even as her legs refused to hold her weight. My baby, I never stopped believing, I never stopped—" Obinna dropped to his knees in the dust beside her, gathering his mother into his arms for the first time in 6 years, and the two of them wept together in the middle of Freedom Market, while the entire crowd stood frozen, witnessing a resurrection none of them would ever forget. Ngozi, who 3 days earlier had waved a broom at him and called him diseased trash, stood at the edge of the crowd, with her hand pressed to her mouth, her face draining of color as the pieces assembled in her mind. Tobena, the guard who had shoved him twice for asking after work, lowered his eyes, unable to meet the scene in front of him. Whispers spread through the market like wildfire. "That's the Adeyemi boy, the one who drowned. He's alive. He's been living among us this whole time," until the entire market had gone still, hundreds of people holding their breath around a single reunited family. "I looked for you." Chidinma wept into her son's ragged shoulder, gripping the torn fabric of his hoodie as if letting go might make him vanish again. "Every single day for 6 years. I looked for you. I never let them close the file." "I know, Mama," Obinna whispered, holding her as gently as he'd once folded a stranger's laundry. "I felt it. I felt you looking, even when I couldn't come home." "Why?" Chidinma pulled back, just enough to search his face, her hands cupping his dirt-streaked cheeks the way they had when he was small. "Why did you let me believe you were dead? Why did you let me bury an empty coffin?" Obinna's eyes flickered just briefly, toward the crowd pressing in around them, toward the phone still recording, toward faces he didn't recognize and couldn't yet trust. "Not here, Mama," he said quietly. "Please, I'll tell you everything, but not here." Chidinma's expression shifted, understanding dawning slow and terrible behind her eyes. The realization that her son's 6 years of silence had not been an accident, but a deliberate, desperate choice made out of fear. "Someone did this to you," she breathed. "Someone made you disappear." Obinna said nothing, which was, in its own way, answer enough. Adaisi stood back from the reunion, tears streaming freely down her own face, understanding now, with a clarity that stole the breath from her lungs, exactly whose lunch she had been sharing for the past week. The homeless man she'd fed from her own table, the man she'd defended against Ngozi's cruelty, the man who had folded her second-hand shirts with such tender, unconscious care, was not simply a stranger in need of kindness. He was Obinna Adeyemi, heir to one of the wealthiest shipping empires in the country, a man the entire nation believed had drowned 6 years ago. As if sensing her thoughts, Obinna turned his head and found her eyes across the small distance between them. Even through the tears, even through 6 years of hidden grief now spilling into the open, he managed something that looked almost like gratitude, a silent, private thank you, meant for her alone, for the 2 lunches she'd packed without ever knowing why, for the kindness that had asked for nothing in return. Chidinma followed her son's gaze and turned to look at Adaye's properly for the first time, taking in the humble stall, the folded second-hand clothes. The woman who had clearly been feeding her son for days without knowing his name meant anything at all. "You," Chidinma said, her voice still thick with tears, but sharpening now with dawning realization. "You've been helping him, feeding him." "I didn't know who he was," Adaise said quickly, suddenly self-conscious under the weight of the older woman's attention. "I only knew he was hungry." Something shifted in Chidinma's face, grief giving way, just slightly, to a fierce and grateful warmth. "Then you have given my son something money could never buy," she said, reaching out to grip Adaise's hand with surprising strength. "You have given him kindness when the whole world had turned its back on him. I will never forget this. Never." And somewhere across the city, in an office overlooking the docks, Fabian Adeyemi's phone buzzed with a message from his private investigator. 3 words that turned his blood to ice. "He's been found." The Adeyemi mansion had not welcomed Obinna home the way he'd imagined it 1,000 times during his years on the street. There had been no grand celebration, no crowd of relieved staff lining the driveway. Chidinma had insisted on discretion, a quiet return through the service entrance, curtains drawn, phones confiscated from the household staff until she could decide how much of the truth the world was allowed to know. She'd learned, over 6 years of quiet suspicion, that safety mattered more than spectacle. Obinna sat now in a hot bath for the first time in longer than he could remember, scrubbing 6 years of road dust from skin that had forgotten what warm water felt like. When he finally emerged, dressed in clothes that had been kept unworn in his old closet all this time, his mother had never let anyone touch his room. He stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. He looked, for the first time in years, like Obinna Adeyemi again, and somehow that felt more disorienting than any of the months he'd spent sleeping under bridges. "You're thinner than in the photographs," Chidinma said from the doorway, her eyes tracing every line of his face as though memorizing him against the possibility he might vanish again. "Much thinner. I'll fix that, Mama. You'll fix that by eating everything this house has to offer, starting immediately." She stepped further into the room, her composure returning by degrees now that the shock of the market had settled into something steadier, grief transforming slowly into fierce protective purpose. "Now, tell me everything, from the beginning. I want every detail." So he told her. He told her about the business trip 6 years ago, the one meant to finalize a new shipping contract along the coast, the private boat his father's company had used for decades without incident. He told her about the storm that hadn't quite been a storm, clear skies, calm water, and yet somehow the boat had lurched violently enough to throw him overboard. He told her about the hands on his shoulders in the water just before he went under, hands that had felt less like they were trying to save him and more like they were making certain he stayed down. "I couldn't prove it," he said, staring at his own hands, remembering the cold, remembering the burn of salt water in his lungs. "It happened so fast. By the time I fought my way to the surface again, the boat was already pulling away, not turning back to search for me. Pulling away, Mama, speeding up." Chidinma's face had gone pale, ashen. "Who was on that boat with you?" 3 crew members, and Fabian. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Chidinma's hands, folded tightly in her lap, went white at the knuckles. "Fabian was there," she repeated slowly. "He told everyone afterward that he'd tried to pull me back in, that the current had been too strong, that by the time they circled back it was already too late to find me." Obinna's jaw tightened. "I believed, for a long time, that maybe it really had been an accident, that the hands I felt were his, trying to help, and I'd simply misread panic for something worse. But the longer I stayed away, watching from a distance whenever I dared, the more the pieces started fitting together in ways I didn't want to see." "What pieces?" "Fabian took control of the company within 3 months of my death being declared. Not a year, not even 6 months. 3 months, Mama. He pushed through emergency provisions that should have taken far longer to process. He restructured half our shipping contracts to route through companies I'd never heard of before, companies I later learned he'd quietly built stakes in years before the accident ever happened." Obinna's voice had gone hard, precise, the voice of a man who had spent 6 years turning every detail over in his mind with nothing else to occupy the empty hours. "He didn't grieve like someone who'd lost family, Mama. He organized, efficiently, immediately, like a man executing a plan rather than surviving a tragedy." Chidinma sat very still, absorbing this. 6 years of quiet unease, finally finding a shape she could name. "I always wondered," she said softly, "how quickly he seemed to move on. How eager he was for me to sign things, close accounts, finalize your estate. I told myself it was simply his nature, practical, businesslike, never one for sentiment. I never let myself consider that he might have wanted me gone, Obina finished quietly. I know, Mama, because I didn't want to consider it either. He's family. He grew up in this house nearly as much as I did after his own parents passed. The thought that he could have... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, the betrayal still too raw even after 6 years to speak aloud without his voice breaking. So you disappeared, Chidinma said. You let the whole world let me believe you were dead, rather than come home and risk him finishing what he started. I couldn't protect myself and you at the same time, not without proof, Obina said. I had nothing. No evidence, no witnesses willing to speak against him, nothing but a feeling in my gut and a memory I couldn't fully trust. If I'd come home accusing him without proof, he would have painted me as unstable, traumatized, perhaps even dangerous. He would have found a way to isolate me from you, or worse, and this time he wouldn't have made the mistake of leaving me alive to tell the story. Chidinma reached across the space between them and took her son's hands in both of hers, gripping them with a strength that belied her age. Then we get proof, she said, steel entering her voice, the same steel that had built and protected a shipping empire for 4 decades. We get proof, and we take back what belongs to you. Mama, it's not safe. Neither was living on the streets for 6 years, and you survived that, she said fiercely. You are not hiding anymore, Obina. Not in my house. Not while I still draw breath. 3 floors below them, unaware of the conversation happening above his head, Fabian Adeyemi sat in his private study nursing a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, staring at a photograph of the family he'd spent 6 years carefully rebuilding around his own ambitions. His phone buzzed against the desk. A message from the private investigator sent hours earlier that he'd been too afraid to open until now. He opened it with trembling hands. Confirmed, it's him, he's already at the mansion. Mrs. Adeyemi knows. Fabian's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, whiskey pooling dark across the polished wood like something spilled and irreversible. 6 years of careful work, unraveling in a single afternoon. He had exactly one choice left, and he knew it with the cold, clear certainty of a man who had already crossed one unforgivable line and understood there was no meaningful difference between crossing it once and crossing it twice. Obina Adeyemi needed to disappear again, permanently this time, before he could ever speak his suspicions aloud to a courtroom, a journalist, or anyone with the power to take everything Fabian had built. Across the city, in the quiet hours after the market had closed, Adeyemi sat outside her small home shelling beans by lamplight, unable to stop thinking about the astonishing turn her ordinary week had taken. Chukwemeka sat beside her, peppering her with questions she didn't fully know how to answer. So he's rich, like really rich. Rich like the people on television. I suppose he is, Adeyemi said, still turning the day's events over in her mind, like a smooth stone she couldn't quite set down. And his mother said she'd never forget what you did. Does that mean she'll give us money? Emeka. Adeyemi gave her son a gentle look. I didn't feed that man because I wanted something from him. I fed him because he was hungry and I had bread to share. That's all it was, and that's all it needs to be. But even as she said it, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her calm. Not greed exactly, but a quiet, uncertain hope that perhaps kindness, offered without condition, might still find its way back around in forms she couldn't yet predict. She thought of Obina's face in that final moment before Chidinma's car had carried them both away, the silent gratitude in his eyes, the promise unspoken but understood between them that this was not truly goodbye. She had no way of knowing that in a mansion across the city, a man was being hunted by the very family member who was supposed to protect him, or that her own quiet kindness had already made her more visible and more important than she could possibly imagine. Fabian didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study until the whiskey stain on the floor had dried into a dull, dark shadow, turning over every possible outcome with the cold precision that had made him, for 6 years, an unquestioned master of the boardroom. Killing Obina a second time was too dangerous, too obvious, too likely to draw exactly the kind of scrutiny he'd spent 6 years avoiding. No, he needed something subtler, something that would make the family, the board, the public doubt Obina's very identity, doubt his sanity, doubt everything he might try to say against him. By morning, Fabian had a plan, and it began with a phone call to a lawyer whose discretion he'd purchased many times before. "I need documents," Fabian said quietly into the phone. "Psychiatric records. From an institution. Doesn't matter which one. Doesn't matter if they're real. I need it to look like a man calling himself Obina Adeyemi has a documented history of delusion, of impersonation, of instability. Can you arrange that?" "For the right price, Mr. Adeyemi, I can arrange almost anything." "Then arrange it, quickly." By that afternoon, Fabian arrived at the mansion unannounced, his face arranged into an expression of careful, practiced concern. The mask he'd worn for 6 years. So familiar now, it barely felt like acting anymore. "Obina," he said, opening his arms as though greeting a beloved cousin returned from the dead, though his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed none of the warmth his voice carried. "Thank God. Thank God you're alive. I can't believe it. I can't believe any of this." Obina studied him for a long moment, 6 years of careful survival instincts, screaming warnings. His cousin's smooth performance couldn't quite silence. "Fabian," he said evenly, "it's been a long time. Too long. Where have you been? What happened to you?" Fabian's voice cracked with what sounded, to anyone who hadn't spent 6 years hunted and hiding, like genuine emotion. "I nearly drowned," Obina said carefully, watching his cousin's face for any flicker of guilt, any crack in the composed grief. "I've spent 6 years trying to understand exactly how that happened." Something flickered behind Fabian's eyes, gone almost before it appeared, but Obina caught it, the way a man who has learned to read danger in every shifting expression catches even the smallest tell. "A terrible accident," Fabian said smoothly. "I've never forgiven myself for not pulling you back in fast enough. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought about it." "Funny," Obina said quietly. "I've thought about it every day too, especially the part where the boat sped away instead of circling back to search for me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Chidima, standing near the window, watched the exchange with sharpening attention. 6 years of quiet suspicion finally finding confirmation in the tension crackling between the two men. "The current was strong," Fabian said, his voice tightening almost imperceptibly. "The captain made the call that circling back risked capsizing us all. It was a terrible decision, but it was the safest one available at the time." "Was it?" Obina's voice remained deceptively calm. "Because I remember hands on my shoulders, Fabian, right before I went under, hands that didn't feel like they were reaching for me. They felt like they were pushing." The room went utterly silent. Fabian's carefully composed mask slipped just for an instant, revealing something cold and calculating underneath before he forced the concerned expression back into place. "You've been through an unimaginable trauma," he said, his voice taking on a new, careful gentleness that made Chidinma's skin crawl. "Trauma does strange things to memory, Obina. It rewrites things, distorts them. Auntie, surely you understand that after everything he's endured, some of what he remembers might not be entirely—" "Don't," Chidinma said sharply, cutting him off with a single word. "Don't you dare finish that sentence in my house." I'm only trying to help him, Fabian said, wounded innocence sliding across his face like a well-rehearsed costume. I've actually taken the liberty of consulting a specialist about cases like this. Men who've suffered severe trauma sometimes develop false memories, even false beliefs about their own identity. I only want to make sure Obinna gets the care he needs before he says something to the press that he can't take back. Something that might embarrass this family or worse, expose him to ridicule if it turns out his memories aren't entirely reliable. Are you suggesting my son is lying about who he is? Chidinma's voice had gone dangerously quiet, the voice of a woman who had built an empire and buried it in silk gloves for exactly moments like this one. I'm suggesting we proceed carefully, Fabian said. For his sake, for the company's sake. There are people, investors, board members, journalists, who will ask difficult questions the moment this becomes public. Questions about identity verification, about mental fitness, about whether the man standing in this room is truly who he claims to be, or whether grief and desperation have led this family to embrace an imposter. Obinna felt something cold settle in his chest, the particular horror of watching a familiar face say monstrous things in a calm, reasonable tone. As though cruelty could be made acceptable simply by dressing it in the language of caution and concern. He remembered, suddenly and vividly, sitting beside Fabian as boys, sharing a single bicycle between them because neither family could afford two. He remembered trusting this man with every secret he'd ever had. He wondered how long the rot beneath that trust had been growing, unnoticed, while he'd been too busy loving a cousin who apparently had never loved him back. I have a birthmark, Obinna said flatly. I have a scar behind my ear that any doctor can verify. I have memories only I would know. This isn't a question of identity, Fabian. It's a question of who pushed me into that water and why. Fabian's mask finally fully cracked. You have nothing, he snapped, all pretense of warmth evaporating in an instant, replaced by something sharp and furious, and finally, unmistakably guilty. No proof, no witnesses, nothing but a half-drowned memory from a man who spent 6 years living on the streets, eating from strangers' charity like an animal. Do you really think anyone will believe you over me? I have run this company successfully for 6 years. I have kept it profitable, kept the board happy, kept everything intact while you were off playing beggar in some market. So it's true, Chidinma said, her voice barely above a whisper, devastation and fury warring across her face in equal measure. You did this. You tried to kill my son. The silence that followed was absolute. Fabian's chest heaved, his composure finally completely gone, his true face exposed at last after 6 years of careful performance, cold, ambitious, and utterly without remorse. He was always going to inherit everything, Fabian said, his voice low and bitter now, no longer bothering to disguise the venom beneath it. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed my own life to maintain, was always going to slip through my fingers the moment he decided to come home and play prince again. I gave this company 6 years of my life. I earned what I have. I wasn't going to hand it back to a man who never had to earn anything at all. You threw my son into the ocean, Chidinma said, each word landing like a blow, and you let me bury an empty coffin, and you let me weep every single night for 6 years, and you sat across from me at dinner, and you comforted me, and you lied to my face every single day since. I did what needed to be done, Fabian said coldly, and I'll do whatever needs to be done now, too. His hand slid slowly, deliberately, toward his jacket pocket. Chidinma's breath caught. She had known Fabian's ambition for years, had watched him quietly maneuver through boardrooms with a patience that sometimes unsettled her. but she had never once imagined that ambition could curdle into something capable of violence in her own home, in front of her own eyes. "Fabian, think about what you're doing," she said, her voice shaking now, the fury of moments before giving way to something closer to fear. "There are people who know he's alive. The market saw. There are witnesses. You cannot simply—" "I know," Fabian said, and something in his flat, resigned tone was more frightening than any anger could have been. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Too many people know now, which means there's only one way to make this clean." His hand emerged from his jacket, and the study fell into a silence so complete that Chidinma could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Obinna moved first. Obinna's body remembered things his mind hadn't fully processed yet. 6 years of sleeping with one eye open, 6 years of reading danger in the smallest shift of a stranger's shoulders, 6 years of learning, the hard way, and that hesitation could cost everything. He crossed the distance between himself and Fabian before his cousin's hand had fully cleared his jacket pocket, seizing his wrist and slamming it hard against the edge of the mahogany desk. Something small and metallic clattered to the floor, not a weapon as Chidinma had feared, but a phone, its screen cracking against the hardwood. "Get off me!" Fabian shouted, wrenching his arm free, his composed mask now entirely gone, replaced by raw, cornered fury. "You were calling someone," Obinna said, breathing hard, adrenaline finally catching up with instincts that had moved faster than conscious thought. "Who? More men to finish what you started 6 years ago?" Fabian said nothing, which told them everything. "Get out of this house," Chidinma said, her voice trembling with a fury so complete it had gone eerily calm. "Get out, before I call the police myself and tell them exactly what you just confessed to in front of us both." "You have no proof," Fabian spat, straightening his jacket with hands that shook despite his effort at composure. "Nothing you say in this room means anything without evidence, and you have none. A confession spoken in anger, denied the moment I walk out that door, is worthless in any courtroom in this country." He was right, and all three of them knew it. Fabian turned and walked out of the study with the same cold precision he'd carried into it, leaving behind a shattered phone and a family reeling from the confirmation of a betrayal they'd suspected but never fully allowed themselves to believe. The following days moved with a strange, dangerous quiet. Fabian did not resign from the company. He did not flee the country, as Obinna half expected him to. Instead, he did something far more calculating. He went to work immediately, quietly mobilizing every resource he'd spent 6 years accumulating. Within 48 hours, an anonymous tip reached 3 major news outlets, suggesting that the man claiming to be Obinna Adeyemi was, in fact, a con artist who had spent months studying the family from a distance before staging an elaborate impersonation, preying on a grieving mother desperate to believe her son had returned. Within 72 hours, a woman none of them recognized appeared on a popular talk show, tearfully claiming to have dated Obinna for the past year, describing a relationship built on lies and manipulation, insisting the man now living in the Adeyemi mansion had confessed to her, in private, that his entire identity was fabricated. Within a week, board members who had known Obinna since childhood began quietly requesting DNA verification before they would resume any business dealings, their loyalty to the family suddenly, conveniently uncertain in the face of manufactured doubt. "He's dismantling you piece by piece," Chidinma said one evening, watching the latest segment with mounting horror, the woman's tearful, rehearsed testimony playing across the screen for the 3rd time that hour. "He's turning the entire country against you before you've even had the chance to defend yourself." "I know," Obinna said quietly, though something in his voice had steadied since the confrontation in the study. The fear of the past 6 years, slowly, deliberately transforming into something closer to resolve. But he's made one mistake. What mistake? He's underestimated the people who never doubted me in the first place. The next morning, Obinna returned to Freedom Market for the first time since his identity had been revealed, and this time he did not come alone or in disguise. Chidinma insisted on accompanying him, along with the family's longtime lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Beatrice, who had served the Adeyemis for 30 years and had never once, in all that time, given Fabian her full trust. Adaiz looked up from her stall to find Obinna standing before her, dressed now in clothes that fit him properly, his hair cut, his beard trimmed, looking every inch the man his mother's photographs remembered, and yet somehow, impossibly, still recognizable as the same person who had folded her shirts with such careful, grateful hands. "You came back," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken to him weeks earlier, when he'd returned the cloth she'd wrapped his lunch in. "I need your help," Obinna said. "You and Ngozi and Tobena and everyone who saw what happened here that day. My cousin is trying to convince the entire country that I'm a fraud. I need people willing to tell the truth about what they witnessed. Not for money, not for anything except the truth itself." Adaiz didn't hesitate. "I'll tell them exactly what I saw," she said. "A hungry man who folded shirts like he respected them. A mother who recognized her son's necklace from across a crowded market. That's not something anyone can fabricate, and I won't let anyone twist it into a lie." Ngozi, when approached, was more hesitant, her earlier cruelty toward Obinna making her reluctant to step forward publicly. But Adaize spoke with her privately, reminding her gently that admitting a mistake was its own kind of courage, and by the following afternoon, Ngozi had agreed to speak on record as well. Her account of the market reunion, corroborating every detail Adaize had already provided. Beatrice, working quickly and quietly, gathered sworn statements from a dozen market vendors who had witnessed the reunion firsthand, cross-referenced hospital records, confirming the scar behind Obinna's ear matched a childhood injury documented in his medical file, and, most critically, tracked down the boat's original captain, a man Fabian had quietly paid to relocate to a distant coastal town 6 years earlier, and who, faced with the possibility of being charged as an accessory, finally agreed to tell the truth about what he'd witnessed that day on the water. "Fabian ordered me to keep the boat moving," the captain confessed in a recorded statement Beatrice obtained within days. "He told me Obinna had fallen and that circling back would risk all our lives in rough water. But the water wasn't rough. I've captained that route 100 times. I knew something was wrong, and I was too afraid of losing my job, and later too afraid of what Fabian might do to me to ever say so." The evidence, once assembled, was overwhelming, undeniable, comprehensive, and utterly devastating to the carefully constructed narrative Fabian had spent a week building in the press. Beatrice filed everything with the police on a Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, as reporters descended on the Adeyemi mansion in a frenzy no longer sympathetic to Fabian's story, word reached the family that he had been intercepted at the airport, boarding pass in hand for a one-way flight to a country with no extradition treaty, his carefully rehearsed escape arriving just hours too late to outrun the truth he'd spent 6 years trying to bury at the bottom of the ocean. Chidinma received the news standing in her private study, in the exact spot where Fabian had once stood, insisting her son might be a stranger wearing her grief like a costume. She felt no triumph in the moment, only a bone-deep exhaustion, and beneath it, a grief entirely separate from the one she'd carried for 6 years, grief for the nephew she'd raised as her own, for the boy who had once shared a single bicycle with her son, for the family that had quietly, invisibly rotted from the inside, while she'd been too consumed by loss to notice. "I keep thinking about when they were children," she told Obinna that night, the two of them sitting together on the mansion's wide veranda, the city's distant lights scattered like fallen stars beneath the dark. "He used to follow you everywhere. He idolized you." "I know," Obinna said quietly. "I think that's exactly why it happened. Admiration curdles strangely, Mama, when it's never given the chance to become anything of its own." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that somewhere between childhood devotion and grown ambition, something in Fabian had broken in a way that no apology, no confession, no measure of family loyalty could ever fully repair. Some betrayals didn't just end relationships. They rewrote the entire history of them, forcing you to look backward and wonder how much of what you remembered as love had, in fact, always been something else entirely, patiently waiting. Word of the captain's confession and the mounting evidence spread quickly through the city, and within Freedom Market, the mood shifted from cautious curiosity to something closer to pride, the sense that their small, dusty corner of the world had somehow become the place where an impossible truth had finally been allowed to surface. Adaeze found herself, in the days that followed, treated with a strange new deference by vendors who had barely acknowledged her before, though she waved most of it away with the same steady humility that had carried her through 11 years of hardship. "I only fed a hungry man," she told anyone who asked. The rest was never mine to claim credit for. But privately, watching the news unfold each evening on Ifeoma's small television, propped against a stack of plantain crates, she allowed herself one quiet, unshakable thought, that sometimes the smallest kindness, offered without any expectation of return, could ripple outward into consequences far larger than the person offering it could ever have imagined. She had no way of knowing, watching those broadcasts, that the story was not yet finished, that one final confrontation still waited, and that her own name was about to become part of it in ways she never could have anticipated. Fabian Adeyemi's trial lasted 3 weeks and dominated headlines the entire time, a story so improbable that even seasoned journalists admitted off the record that they'd never covered anything quite like it. A man declared dead, resurrected in a marketplace, and the cousin who'd orchestrated his disappearance finally brought to justice by a coalition of market vendors, a frightened boat captain, and a mother who had simply refused to stop believing. The captain's testimony proved decisive. Corroborated by financial records Beatrice had painstakingly assembled, showing the quiet payments Fabian had made to relocate him, silence him, and keep him compliant for 6 long years. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a verdict that surprised no one who had followed the evidence, guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, and 6 years of elaborate fraud designed to conceal it. Fabian was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his once immaculate composure finally completely shattered, his eyes searching the gallery for some flicker of sympathy he would never find there again. Chidinma did not attend the sentencing. She had told Obinna quietly that she'd spent enough of her life looking at that face and searching for the boy she'd once loved inside it. She was finished looking. The company, once the dust settled, was restored fully to Obinna's control, though he made it clear in his first public address as its rightful head that he intended to run it differently than either his father or his cousin ever had. "I spent 6 years without a name," he told the assembled reporters, his mother standing proudly at his side, sleeping in places most of you would never willingly walk past, eating food I hadn't earned and couldn't repay, treated as invisible by people who had no idea what circumstances had brought me to that street corner. I learned something in those 6 years that no business degree ever taught me, that the measure of a person has nothing to do with what they own, and everything to do with what they're willing to give away when they have nothing left to spare. He paused, finding a familiar face in the crowd of reporters. Adaeze, who Chidinma had personally insisted attend, dressed in a new dress the older woman had gifted her, though Adaeze had protested the extravagance for nearly an hour before finally accepting. "There is a woman standing in this room," Obinna continued, his voice thickening with emotion. He no longer felt any need to hide, "who fed me from her own table when she had barely enough to feed her own children. She didn't know my name. She didn't know I had money, power, or a company waiting for me. She only knew I was hungry, and she decided that was reason enough to share what little she had. I am alive today, in every sense that matters, because of people like her. People the world walks past every single day without ever truly seeing." The room fell silent, dozens of cameras capturing the moment Obinna crossed to where Adaeze stood, taking both her hands in his, the way he had that first day she'd pressed a small bundle of food into his palms and asked for nothing in return. "I want to formally announce," he said, turning back to face the cameras, "the creation of the Adaeze Foundation, funded with an initial endowment of 200 million naira, dedicated to supporting small vendors, feeding programs, and emergency assistance for anyone who finds themselves, through no fault of their own, without a place to call home. It is named for the woman who taught me, more powerfully than any lesson I learned in this house, what it truly means to see another human being." Adaeze's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely down her face as the assembled reporters erupted into questions, as Chidinma stepped forward to embrace her, as Chukwuemeka, invited to witness the announcement, stared at his mother with wide-eyed astonishment that seemed to ask silently whether the world had simply tilted sideways overnight. "I never wanted anything in return," Adaeze managed, her voice breaking. "I only wanted to help." "I know," Obinna said gently. "That's exactly why it matters so much." In the months that followed, the foundation grew faster than anyone anticipated, funding new market infrastructure across the city, establishing scholarship programs for vendors' children, and building emergency shelters that Adaeze herself helped design, drawing on 11 years of understanding, more intimately than any architect could, what struggling families actually needed. Ngozi, humbled by her own earlier cruelty, became one of the Foundation's most passionate volunteers, spending her evenings organizing donation drives with an energy that surprised everyone who remembered her broom-waving fury that first day. To Benna, the security guard, was offered a position managing safety for the Foundation's shelters, a quiet redemption neither he nor anyone else had expected, but one he accepted with genuine gratitude. Obinna visited Freedom Market often, sometimes still dressed simply, sitting on the same overturned crate beside Adaeze's stall, though now the crowd that gathered around him did so with warmth rather than suspicion. He and Adaeze had become close in a way neither of them fully articulated to others. Not quite family, not quite anything so easily named, but bound by something deeper than gratitude, a mutual recognition forged in a moment when one stranger had chosen to see another's humanity before anything else. "Do you ever think about it?" Adaeze asked him one evening, months later, as the market emptied around them and the sky turned soft gold above the rooftops. "How different everything would be if I'd simply ignored you that first day, the way everyone else did. Obina considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things now, having learned the hard way how much weight small moments could carry. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to walking past this stall without stopping, too ashamed to ask for anything, too broken to believe anyone would help me even if I did. I think about how easily that day could have ended with me disappearing back into the crowd, unnoticed, unremembered, another ghost the city simply absorbed." He looked at her, something profound and grateful in his eyes. "You didn't just feed a hungry man that day, Adais. You reminded a man who'd forgotten his own name that he still mattered to someone. That's not a small thing. That might be the largest thing anyone has ever done for me." Adais smiled, shaking her head gently. "You give me too much credit. I only did what my mother taught me, what any decent person should do without needing to be asked." "That's precisely the problem," Obina said. "Most people never do it, even when they've been asked 100 times. You did it before anyone asked at all." Chidinma, watching them from a distance with the quiet satisfaction of a mother who had finally fully gotten her son back, found herself thinking of her own mother's words, passed down through generations of women who had understood something essential about the world, long before it became fashionable to say aloud, that kindness, given freely, without calculation, without expectation of return, had a way of finding its way back to you, often when you least expected it, and always in a form far larger than the gift you'd originally offered. The ruby necklace, cleaned now and repaired where 6 years of hardship had worn its clasp thin, hung once again around Obina's neck, not hidden beneath torn fabric this time, but worn openly, proudly, a symbol no longer of a man in hiding, but of a family finally, fully restored. And in the corner of Freedom Market where fabric sellers met fruit sellers, a second-hand clothing table continued its quiet, ordinary business each morning, its owner folding shirts with the same careful pride she always had, though now, beside her table, a small plaque had been installed, simple and unassuming, reading only, "Kindness costs nothing. Its value is beyond measure." It was, everyone who read it agreed, exactly the kind of lesson a market like this one had always understood, long before the world outside its dusty borders had ever bothered to learn it.